As everybody will remember from their school days, as Gavin talks about them, there are two major immune systems in our body. There is the adaptive immune response, which is capable of responding to new antigens, and for example, T cell or B cell activation via antigen presentation through dendritic cells. And there's also the innate immune response, which involves proteins and cells, for example, natural killer cells, that are considered the first line of immune defense and recognize foreign material. Now, within cancer, and there has been, and there's always been, a dedicated group of people working within this cancer immune area. We know that from a lot of research that there is a release of cancer cell antigens by cancer cells, particularly when the cancer cells die. And then these are presented to dendritic cells, antigen-presenting cells. And then you get priming and activation of T cells and antigen-presenting cells, trafficking of the T cells to the tumour, infiltration of T cells into those tumours, recognition of cancer cells, and then killing of those cancer cells. And that's what happens with immune surveillance. Effectively, that immune surveillance, we're producing abnormal cells all the time, and our body's immune surveilling these and killing these cells as they develop. And so, for the most part, we're dealing with elimination, where we get effective antigen processing presentation, and then we eliminate those cells. So the cancer cells don't get an opportunity to proliferate and expand. However, under certain conditions, and often under conditions of chronic inflammation, a cell acquires a mutation and is actually supported by the immune system to stay alive. And so when that starts happening, you get what's called an equilibrium. And so that allows a cell that's genetically unstable to evolve and to change. Okay? And as that cell evolves and changes, it may eventually become malignant, whereby it develops a capacity to invade locally, initially, and then with further evolution to disseminate to other parts of the body. And this happens with escape, and that's what tumours basically do in terms of avoiding the immune system. So there are a number of mechanisms that the cancers use to do this, to escape from the immune system. There's inhibition of the tumour antigen presentation, downregulation of MHC class 1, for example, and defects in the antigen-presenting cell mechanisms. There could be secretion of immunosuppressive factors. This is probably one of the most common things that happens when you've got chronic inflammation. So chronic inflammation, you get a secretion of things like IL-6, IL-10, TGF-beta, and all of these things will suppress the immune response. You get recruitment of immunosuppressive cell types, so myeloid-derived suppressor cells. You get disruption of the checkpoint inhibitory signaling and stimulatory signaling. So using all of these mechanisms, cancers learn to evade the immune response. And these are just some of the inhibitory factors that we know about, CTLA4 and PD-L1, which we're going to focus on today, but there are others like TIM3 and LAG3, and these are some of the activating receptors which we can use to potentially boost the immune response. But interestingly, to date, none of these activating signals on their own seem to work very well. They seem to require removal of the inhibitory checkpoints as well. At the moment, we're not sure what's going to happen in the future, but if you think about things like IL-2 and the interferons, they were all about stimulating the white cells to attack the cancers. Didn't work terribly well, a little bit, but not terribly well. So essentially, do we have an immune response to cancer? And some people think we don't have, but in fact, reality is that every patient's cancer has an effective immune response against it. It just doesn't work very well. So it's a real immune response. So tumour antigen-directed antibodies are detectable in virtually all cancers. Paraneoplastic immune-related disorders, for example, are associated with improved survival. So we know if you've got an activated immune response, it may actually be working to some extent, but it's not good enough to clear the tumour on its own. P53 antibodies are associated with a better outcome in small cell lung cancer. And finally, the levels and type and microlocalization of tumour-infiltrating lymphocytes, macrophages, mast cells, are associated with outcome in resected tumours. So do we have an immune-driven, are there immune-driven tumours in non-small cell lung cancer? There is some evidence that you can get spontaneous tumour regression. It's very rare, but it has been reported. More commonly seen in things like melanoma and renal cell cancer. But when you look at the prognostic role, I don't expect you to read these, I mean you can look at these afterwards, but if you look at the prognostic role of infiltrating cells in lung cancer, for example, many types of infiltration are associated with outcome, some with a good prognosis and some with a poor prognosis. And it often depends where those cells are. So I just got a bit of work that we did where we looked at the infiltration of cells either into tumour islets or into the stroma. And what we found was that if the tumour to stroma infiltration level was high for CD8 positive cells, you had a very favourable outcome. This is very similar to data that was reported for colorectal cancer. If you had the same situation with FOXP3 cells, the opposite happened. And FOXP3 positive cells tend to be immunosuppressive. So if they're in the islets, people tended to do significantly worse. And if you look down for macrophages or mast cells, you get the same situation, which allows you to kind of build prognostic scores based on where those cells are, whether they're in the islets or in the stroma, and the type of cells that you have. Now, this is not used very much clinically, but it just tells us that the nature of the immune response does have an impact on how well patients do after surgery. So the big step forward, and has been the Nobel Prize, got rightly awarded to the team of people who worked in this area and discovered these checkpoints, is targeting CTLA-4 and PD-1. And CTLA-4 has commonly been associated with an interaction between the antigen-presenting cells, the dendritic cells, and the T cells activation, or in fact, in this case of CTLA-4, inhibition of that interaction. And then the tumour microenvironment itself, where you have the interaction between PD-1 and PD-L1, which we're going to focus on today. There are other things involved, but where the tumour cell produces the ligand that interacts with the receptor on the T cell, and basically it activates that T cell. So it's a bit like a politician. The politician tells you, I'm okay, and you only realise later how dangerous they are, okay? So it's the same kind of a thing. And so basically the T cells don't recognise the tumour cell. They leave it alone and say, oh, you are the same as us, and only find out later that, in fact, they weren't, okay? So that's the way that works. But it's important to remember that this interaction also happens in the periphery. So the T cell and dendritic cell also use PD-1 and PD-L1 interactions to create tolerance in the periphery. So you get localized tolerance in the microenvironment, but you also get peripheral tolerance. And this is really important. And it may be important, it may explain why chemotherapy, for example, works better after immune therapy, even though the patient may progress through the immune therapy, which we can come on to maybe in a discussion later on. Now, one of the things that's important is that the expression of PD-L1 on the tumour cell is associated with resistance to the T cells, but it's also associated with increased sensitivity to PD-L1 targeted therapies. Now, I'm going to come on to that in my second talk in more detail, but this is just to give a flavour of this. You can see there that the more PD-L1 you have, the more likely you are to respond to immune therapy. And this is just showing that the survival of these patients, progression-free and overall survival, is increased. The other thing that's emerging is the tumour mutation burden. And the reason why that's important is because the more mutations you have, particularly if they're called non-synonymous or frame-shift mutations, the more likely you are to make new proteins that can be presented as neoantigens to the immune system. And again, we'll talk about that more later. And the importance of this lies in this study here, where by Rebsy et al., the first study in Science, which showed that patients with high non-synonymous mutation burden did better than those that had a low level of expression of those. Likewise, there was mismatch repair deficiency, where you make lots and lots and lots of proteins. They tend to be associated with a good response to immune therapies. So the more neoantigens you make, the more important it is, the more likely you are to respond to therapy. But I think an area that's beginning to emerge that looks really interesting is pre-existing immunity and benefit from therapy. So if your tumour is inflamed, if it's full of white cells, you're more likely to respond to immune therapy than if it's a non-inflamed tumour. Okay, so that data is emerging all the time, and the inflamed tumours tend to be those that have high levels of PD-L1 expression. So there is an association there. What about clinical factors that might be important in determining benefit? So we concentrate often on the biological factors, we sometimes forget about the clinical factors. And there's this association between what's called a lung immune prognostic index and outcome. Okay, and the modified lung immune prognostic index, which we've looked at, is your performance status, LDH, the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. And what we find is that if you've got a high score, if you get a low score, you do well. If you got a high score, you do badly. So if your neutrophil lymphocyte ratio is high, your performance status is greater than 1, and your LDH is elevated, you do badly. The opposite is the case if it's your good performance status, normal, neutrophil lymphocyte ratio less than 3, and LDH is normal, you do better. Okay, that's both for overall survival and progression-free survival. And so we had a couple of groups where you've got 0, 1 versus 2, 3, and you can see these big separation in outcome. This is our data with over 200 patients from Brisbane. And response rates are higher. The other thing that's interesting is that you get a toxicity which suggests that your immune system is being activated, you also do better. There's a whole range of these studies coming out now. And this was work done, presented at World Lung by a group from Italy, looking at outcomes based on for progression-free survival and overall survival, looking if you developed 1 or 2 toxicities, you just did better. 2 toxicities did the best, 1 toxicity did better, and none. And they looked at it in terms of time, and if you had the toxicity early, so the toxicity happens early, that group, compared to everybody else, that group still does better. Okay, so it's not that if you develop a toxicity at any time during your treatment, it's, you know, if it happens even early, that's when you tend to do better with this outcome. So what's the relevance? This is our data showing the same thing: progression-free survival, overall survival better if you get toxicity. But the relevance of this is that the prognostic score we've developed correlates with the likelihood of developing a toxicity. So a low score is associated with an increased likelihood of developing a toxicity. So it tells you that your pre-existing immune status, if you like, in your body, how your body's primed, may affect your outcome. And this is supported by the fact that if you've got high tumour mutation burden, you do badly. Or if you've got high tumour burden, you do badly. If you've got poor performance status, you do badly. So there's a correlation between this baseline simple full blood count biochemistry profile and outcome to treatment. And you can see this is an example of a patient who had a toxicity very early on. After 2 cycles of pembrolizumab, very fit guy. He was in the trial, so performance status was 0.1, and his tumour disappeared. When we stopped the pembrolizumab, he's in remission 3 years later, after just 2 cycles of pembrolizumab. So what this association of the burden of disease and outcome, does it matter in other ways? And it really probably does matter. Early therapy may be best. This is the durvalumab trial versus chemoradiotherapy. Big improvement in survival with 12 months of maintenance durvalumab versus placebo after some benefit to chemoradiation. Okay, so burden of disease might matter. Nivolumab neoadjuvant therapy. Patients who had early stage disease received nivolumab for 2 cycles, and 40% had a major tumour response. Okay, compared to 10% we see with chemotherapy. So 2 cycles only, big response to treatment. And then there's the NADIM study, really important study. This was patients who had chemoimmunotherapy before surgery. And they had a remarkable 60% pathological complete response. We still needed the surgeons, don't worry, Gavin, you're okay. Because we had to get the tumour mass removed when it was still there. But 60% pathological CR and 15% major pathological response, less than 10% of tumour left. And why is that really important? Because the Nelson trial was positive. The Nelson trial was a screening study in at-risk patients. It showed that patients who screening was associated with improved survival, pick-up rate of survival, but the big thing was the stage shift. Stage 3, 4 being shifted to stage 1, 2. So my argument is, right, that the volume of disease matters, okay, because the less disease you have, the less immunosuppressive that tumour is going to be. And with screening and neoadjuvant therapy, we may actually start to cure large numbers of patients. This is a major breakthrough that came through from World Lung. I'll tell you, I left World Lung feeling, yeah, let's go for it. Okay.